We are dealing with Willard Van Orman Quine's classic paper, Two Dogmas of Empiricism. WVOQ. All right. One of the fundamental philosophers in the analytic tradition, and certainly in the philosophy of language. Sort of a classic figure at this point. Died in 2000. But quite a subversive and innovative figure when he arrived. But maybe by the time he was done, he was almost, his views represented a sort of orthodoxy to which, some younger figures, including some of his own students, reacted. On the other hand, there was, great elaboration of his style of thinking too. And I'm going to try to frame up the style of thinking, or give a wider context a little bit for understanding this paper, get us into the issues, because it might seem a little hard to know, what he's arguing, who he's arguing with, and exactly how he's arguing. So I'm going to try to get into a context rather than picking apart any one argument, which I hope to do at least with one or two of them in class on Zoom on Tuesday. Okay, so Quine, long career at Harvard, like I say, quite a fundamental figure. And in one way that he's a fundamental figure, and this paper is really the essence of this, is that he's one of several people who achieve kind of the total destruction of logical positivism. Sometimes analytic philosophy, especially by outsiders like sort of continentalists and stuff, is still kind of associated with logical positivism, or like a real rank version of empiricism. What he means by empiricism in Two Dogmas of Empiricism is logical empiricism a la Ayer. The person he discusses, though, is above all is Carnap. Some of this is on the handout. Okay, although he does connect it to the classical empiricism of people like Hume and Locke. All right, so okay, so there's a host of developments that right around the same time, maybe like this is published in 1951, that are highly critical, devastatingly critical of logical positivism on various grounds. One version of this we saw is Austin's Sense and Sensibilia, which were delivered as lectures through the 40s, probably even the 50s. The total dismantling of sense data theory, aimed between the eyes of A.J. Ayer, but also between the eyes of David Hume and John Locke, okay, and many others. Another version of this, and we saw this too, although maybe we didn't see, well, I mean, we saw stuff that could be easily extended in this direction, and maybe we didn't quite discuss this, but Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, again, and now in this case, he's in part critiquing his own previous position, maybe. He's certainly critiquing what he took to be misunderstandings of his own position by the positivists. And he's really withdrawing, like the idea that, a term or a assertion means the empirical experiences that underlie it or could justify it. That it means its technique of verification empirically through something like sense experience or sense data. That's kind of phenomenalism, I guess we'd say, for one thing. Wittgenstein destroys that too. But the idea that that's how words mean, that meaning is restricted to that, to representing direct sense experience. Wittgenstein, in a way, like he just ignores that as ridiculous. All kinds of stuff is happening in language, and he shows a lot of different things happening, but none of it is that, like, mirroring reality, or giving, the one-to-one correspondence between the meaning of terms and maybe a class of sense data or something. It's just not going to work out. So, but I mean, Wilfrid Sellars is another figure that kind of destroys positivism. Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher of science. I mean, there's a lot of figures that have various roles to play in this. I think a lot of people think that Two Dogmas of Empiricism is a total destruction of logical empiricism, and it certainly is quite fundamental. Now, it seems rather calm. It's highly technical, as Quine often is. I mean, just a killer logician by profession, okay? And it seems rather staid in some ways, maybe not. Actually, Quine is a beautiful writer. That's not always at its most evident here, but there are many lovely moments, actually, as Quine, the writer, in here. He's... but this is an unbelievably bold sally. I mean, what he does here is so quick, is so much. Now, whether he doesn't pay it all off in this paper, but he paid a lot of it off in other writings, in much more detail. Okay, like the whole picture. Here, he just it's almost like a quick hit. And it almost has a bit of an abusive tone in some ways. So these things might be a little hard to pick up. These positions are kind of ridiculous. And actually, Austin has a similar tone, although a completely different methodology. I mean, Quine respects ordinary language. He's thinking about it. But really, it's the technical apparatus of logic that where Quine's heart lies in this thing. All right. Now, one thing about Willard Van Orman Quine. It's one thing that's interesting to me, anyway, is his aesthetic, his philosophical aesthetic. He says at one point, and this is particularly with regard to questions in ontology, on what sorts of things there are. Okay. He says, I have a taste for desert landscapes. He's got the sharpest version of Occam's razor in the history of philosophy. All kinds of entities or words that we throw around with apparent casualness, especially in philosophy. Again, there's a critique of philosophy here, a la Wittgenstein or Austin. Are not going to do. Let's put it that way. But we can show this sort of logical problems. But actually, the argument is not really, when you get down to it, an entirely technical argument. Although it's about question begging. It's about a whole nexus of concepts: synonymy, analyticity, meaning, definition, which are central to empiricism, central to logical positivism, and central to philosophy of other sorts as well. This whole nest of concepts, they're all mutually interdependent. He doesn't believe in any of them, in a way. Okay? Like, he's worried about them all, I'd say, underneath this kind of ontologically. Like, what is a meaning? What sort of thing is a meaning supposed to be? And a typical thing that Quine would say, maybe he doesn't quite say that right here, but he says it many times in other things, like, what kind of ghostly entity is a meaning? Like hovering around a word or something like that, or objects, or whatever it is that means. Getting in between us and the world, intermediary entities, and he means Phrygian sense, among other things. He's got no time for Phrygian senses. But the objection is also logical, because these entities introduce directly the ones that pertain to language, like synonymy and so on. Like he's got probably no time for immaterial souls or anything either in his clean ontology. But he's the ones that are involved with language create definite logical difficulties. Okay, look on the handout on extensionality and intentionality and substitutability, salva veritate, which we have discussed with regard to some of these other figures as well. Maybe I'll get into that a little bit. So, like, for example, he says, and I must say, like, when I first ran into this, I was rather delighted by it. Like, I'm like, yeah, all that shit is mumbo jumbo. What are these mysterious entities? What are these abstract entities and shit that you're postulating? Like, let's get our feet back on the ground, people. You know, like, what are we even talking about? All right. Clean up all these ghostly, mysterious entities. Those are the kind of words we use for abstract things, maybe even numbers and stuff like that. Got to talk about that maybe. But you know, but things like meanings as well, or primarily. Okay, so this is, you know, he's got, like I say, all these logical arguments, but he's also kind of withdraws to these much broader ways, much broader frames, right at the end of the paper, especially. This is on page 22. For the theory of meaning, the most conspicuous question is as to the nature of its objects. What sorts of things are meanings? They are evidently intended to be ideas somehow, mental ideas for some semanticists, Platonic ideas for others, like real things out there somewhere. Objects of either sort are so elusive, not to say debatable, questionable, queer, odd. You know, is queer? That's politically incorrect to say that? That there seems little hope of erecting a fruitful science about them. Okay, so and Quine thinks that, you know, he's kind of a scientistic thinker. You know, basically all human knowledge either is scientific or has to contribute to science in some direct way, or emerge from science in some direct way. All human knowledge. What do meanings help us do? Do we find them in the world at all? You know, like could there be a science of meanings? Because Quine doesn't think so. Depends on what you mean by science, I guess. Okay. It's not even clear granted meanings when we have two and when we have one. Okay. Like the meaning of I don't know, green and chartreuse or something like that. So we there's no even plausible criteria of individuation on meanings. Like these are completely mysterious entities. We think we've explained something. Like, for example, synonymy. Two expressions are synonymous when they have the same meaning. Now we think we've said something, but we don't know what a meaning is. Okay, so we haven't said nothing. So now we can't define synonymy. And if we can't define synonymy, then we can't define terms in any kind of precise, exhaustive way, and so on. Oh my God. It's not even clear when we have two meanings and when we have one. It's not clear when linguistic forms should be regarded as synonymous or alike in meaning and when they should not. And then he raises specific problems and examples where it becomes evident that we don't have precise criteria of synonymy, sameness of meaning for two different expressions. Think of morning star and evening star. Think of, I don't know, 2 and the whole number less than 3, or, you know, just under 3, or whatever it might be. Sorry about that little computer glitch.
All right, sort of continuing on this theme, traversing the piece without running the arguments, of Quine's ontological austerity, his suspicion of all these entities. And he's just sort of rolling into philosophy and definitely into logical positivism and just devastating it with this kind of ontological emphasis. But what the thing about it is, though, I do feel like it's basically motivated aesthetically. Like, why shouldn't we want these entities that we don't quite understand or something like that? Or how can we get rid of them? Or, like you might just go like, well, meanings are the bottom line. Like, we're not going to do without that. So I don't know if we can explain them or not, but we're going to explain other things, only explain other things in terms of them. And he's going, yeah, well, what kind of entity is that? What kind of, he's like Donald Judd, the minimalist sculptor. All right, and like I guess I found this seductive, as I keep saying. At a certain point, I'm like, okay, so like, how about this? Definition. Maybe definition can help. Definitions can tell us the meaning. Maybe the meaning of a word is its definition. Oh yeah, just about in any little dictionary you care to look. Which one? Merriam-Webster or OED? I don't know. Anyone can stipulate any definition they like for any term, and definitely can get it wrong, even in standard reference works. But what is a definition? And actually, he says, I think, we're not going to be able to explain that without leaning on concepts like synonymy and meaning, right? The definition, what is the definition of a term? It's something that is synonymous with the term, that gives the meaning of the term. But we're trying to explain synonymy and meaning through definition, recall. Right? And this is just an example he sets up of all these notions are in a little circle. All of them are mysterious. It's true that they can all interdefine each other, but that just makes it an absurd question-begging little hamster wheel, this whole conceptual framework. And you can't get empiricism, as he understands it, really classical or logical, without these notions. All right. Okay. Another thing he's famous for, and he does put this here, and we have talked a lot about modal expressions, even modal logic in Kripke, and so on, and the semantics of modal expressions about necessity and possibility. Now, Quine is famous for just ruling all of that out. Like, basically saying that that's senseless. I mean, it's useless for science, and it's introduces logical quandaries up the wazoo. And why don't we just do without it? And here's how. Okay, sort of, because I'm not sure we can quite do without it, as he thinks we can. But one thing is that he's suspicious of any set of expressions that apparently introduce intentional contexts that are not fully transparent to substitution of co-referring expressions salva veritate. If in every position in a language expressions are intersubstitutable with preservation of truth, that's an extensional language. I defined all these on the handout. I guess I won't roll them again now. That's not what I'm here for. Real quick, but I mean, I don't know. That was worse than useless, perhaps. But on page 29, though, here's a little bit on modality, famous bit. Let us now see what there is in the above argument that gives it its air of hocus pocus. And the argument concerns necessary truth. We're trying to say what analytic means at this stage of the argument. Necessarily, all and only bachelors or unmarried men. Necessarily all. Okay. The fact that that's a necessary truth is here supposed to be an explanation of its analyticity. That it's a matter of relation of ideas or meanings, not of an empirical fact. Quine is breaking that whole distinction down, man, between the analytic and the synthetic, a la Kant, between matters of fact, truths that concern matters of fact, and truths that concern relations of ideas, a la Hume. Those distinctions he thinks cannot be maintained. And he gets real profound on that right at the end. Okay, but the condition of interchangeability salva veritate varies in its force with variations in the richness of the language at hand. The above argument supposes that we are working with a language rich enough to contain the word necessarily. So now he doesn't even hit the details of the argument. He just says, like, how about that word? You need that word, and you cannot clarify it, not by his standards, or work it into his desert landscape. This adverb necessarily being so construed as to yield truth when and only when applied to an analytic statement. So again, this is an attempt to define analyticity in terms of necessity. We could see these things come apart completely in Kripke. Well, not completely, but different. The concepts are treated differently in Kripke 20 years later. So we could get into that relationship if you want a little bit. But can we condone a language which contains such an adverb as necessarily, or possibly? Does this adverb really make sense? To suppose that it does is to suppose that we already have made satisfactory sense of analytic. Then what are we so hard at work in right now? So he says, like, okay, so you could try to clarify it in terms of necessity, this kind of necessity anyway, in terms of analytic relations among the meanings of words, like the analytic relation between bachelor and unmarried man. You're just rolling the circle of the same goddamn concepts over and over again in empty space. And none of these entities that you're throwing around, you know, are you able to justify or describe in a logically perspicuous way. Okay. I mean, maybe just a second on reductionism. Radical reductionism, as he defines it on the top 36, and this is a feature of logical positivism, defined on the handout, where we reduce any theoretical or large claim, general claim, to the sense data that fund it, give rise to it, justify it, in which it originates, because that's the only input into the human cognitive system. Every meaningful statement is held to be translatable into a statement, true or false, about immediate experience. That's Ayer's position. Radical reductionism, in one form or another, and then he talks about Locke and Hume. He attributes the view to them. I mean, provisionally anyway, or with some qualifications. Okay, so the notion lingers, this is on 38, the notion lingers that to each statement or each synthetic statement, there is associated a unique range of possible sensory events or sense data or whatever it may be, such that or surface irritations, he says, such that the occurrence of any of them would add to the likelihood of the truth of the statement. This is Ayer's position, more or less. And that there is associated also another unique range of possible sensory events whose occurrence would detract from that likelihood. This notion is, of course, implicit in the verification theory of meaning. So when he's attacking reductionism, he's attacking the verification theory of meaning, a la Ayer and Carnap, possibly a la Wittgenstein. The dogma of reductionism survives in the supposition that each statement, taken in isolation from its fellows, can admit of confirmation or disconfirmation at all. My counter-suggestion, issuing essentially from blah, 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 is that our statements about the external world face the tribunal of sense experience, not individually, but only as a corporate body. And now he gets into stating positions for which he's famous, and he states them so fast, and they were so kind of thunderclap influential. Those are semantic holism and his pragmatism about meaning. Okay? Now, so the semantic holism was what I was just saying. We're going to drop the analytic empirical distinction, or analytic synthetic distinction, or the relation of ideas versus matters of fact distinction. We can our belief system is a web, he says in later writings. Or as he says here, the totality of our so-called knowledge or beliefs, from the most casual matters of geography and history to the profoundest laws of atomic physics or even pure mathematics and logic, is a man-made fabric which impinges on experience only at the edges. A man-made fabric, our belief system. So, for example, so I'm always, when I have a new experience or learn new information, I'm always trying to adjust the whole web of my beliefs. It's not a matter of confirming or disconfirming any particular proposition. The whole, it's senseless to talk about specific propositions matching up to specific facts a la Wittgenstein, or specific sense data a la Ayer, and being true or false in that light, in a pure correspondence one-to-one. It's the whole of our language that faces the whole of our experience. We have hundreds of principles and ideas, and each time we get something new, we have to figure out how to incorporate that into the web of our beliefs. This is semantic holism. So, for example, confronted with quantum mechanics, I could, and people did, drop the principle of non-contradiction. It's, they decided that, at least in some cases, it's not true that P and not P cannot be true. Okay, wait a second. Right? They dropped the principle of non-contradiction. That's always a possibility when you have a recalcitrant experience. The question is, what's the adjustment in our whole belief set faced with a new thing that has the least cost? And then this is where Quine gives a really interesting revival of pragmatism. That's his own word for it. That as I think about readjusting my belief set to deal with some new theoretical development or something like this, I have to think about, first of all, the cognitive costs. I probably want to have a principle of conservatism where I want to retain as much of my existing belief set as possible, especially central things like the principle of non-contradiction. That would ramify out into all my beliefs in some sense. It might. So I want to preserve that if possible, because I'm going to have to readjust the entire system. But I could, for example, resolve to think like the experiments are wrong in some respects. Or there's many moves I could make to try to incorporate that into my existing belief set. And I'll choose the one with least cognitive costs, and also perhaps the one that lets me go on most profitably in the research and so on. So that's just the rawest sketch. And like I said, this is a very hard paper. And so I'm trying to give you a lot of material, lecture, handouts, and we will discuss too, and try to get maybe into the meat of some of these arguments on Tuesday on